Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Unknown Orator of 1776. Chapter 1. The Room Where It Happened. Philadelphia, July 1776. The city smelled of horses and river mud, and the particular anxiety of a people who had not yet decided if they were brave enough to do what they were about to do. The summer was hot, the way only a mid-Atlantic summer can be, thick and close, the air pressing down on the cobblestones like a warm hand over a mouth. The Delaware River sat heavy and silver, just blocks from the Pennsylvania State House, which most people still call just that, the State House. The name Independence Hall would only come later, after the world had decided what had happened there deserved a grander title. The building itself was modest by the standard of imperial architecture. 2 stories of Georgian red brick, a white wooden steeple reaching up into the oppressive sky. Inside, the assembly room on the ground floor was perhaps 40 feet wide and 40 feet deep, a room smaller than many modern living rooms, smaller than you'd expect for the birthplace of a nation. The walls were a pale institutional green, a color chosen in an era before anyone thought much about ambiance. Windsor chairs arranged in rows faced a raised dais. Flies moved through the heavy air. The windows were shut tight because the men inside had agreed they needed to speak freely, and freely meant privately. And privately meant without the citizens of Philadelphia pressing their ears to the glass. If this went wrong, and there was every reason to believe it would go wrong, most of the men in that room would be hanged, not figuratively, literally. They were, in the legal language of the British Crown, traitors. Treason was a capital offense. The punishment for it was not merely death, but the specific theatrical cruelty that English law had devised over centuries to make examples. You would be drawn, which meant dragged on a hurdle through the streets, hanged by the neck until nearly dead, then cut down while still alive, so that your abdomen could be opened and your intestines pulled out before your eyes, before you mercifully lost consciousness. Then your body beheaded and quartered, the pieces sent to different corners of the realm as advertisements for what happened to those who defy the king. This was not abstract. This was the explicit legal fate of traitors. The men in that room knew the vocabulary intimately. They used the word gibbet casually in their letters, which should tell you something about how present the gallows were in the ordinary imagination of the 18th century. A gibbet was a post with an arm, from which a hangman's cage or corpse was suspended as a warning, placed at crossroads, at the edges of towns, wherever many people would pass and absorb the lesson. When they said they feared the gibbet, they were not speaking metaphorically. They were speaking from a world in which the consequences of what they were doing were as vivid and immediate as weather. Beyond their own lives, there were their families to consider. Many of these men had wives, children, substantial estates, hard-won social positions built over generations. Benjamin Harris of Virginia had a plantation and family wealth going back decades. Robert Morris, who would become the financier of the Revolution, had commercial interests that a declaration of treason would immediately endanger. Charles Carroll of Carrollton was the wealthiest man in the colonies. When the story says these men pledged their fortunes as well as their lives, it is not rhetorical padding. The financial exposure was real and in many cases staggering. There is also the political dimension that gets lost in retrospective celebration. The colonies were not unanimous. Even within Pennsylvania, the host colony, the site of the Congress, there was substantial loyalist sentiment. The city of Philadelphia itself was full of people who considered themselves loyal British subjects and thought the radicals pushing for independence were dangerous and wrong. The royal governor of New York had fled his mansion, but the colonial apparatus remained. In Virginia, the royal governor Lord Dunmore had actually offered freedom to enslaved people who escaped their rebel masters and joined the British forces. The Dunmore Proclamation of November 1775, which from the British side was a shrewd strike at the revolutionaries' economic and social foundations, but which also from every other angle was a deeply unsettling reminder that the political world was not simply divided between heroes and villains, but between competing orders of power and interest, that the Declaration's elegant language about universal equality could not fully paper over. The war, too, was not going particularly well. The famous early skirmishes, Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, had been won or narrowly lost with considerable colonial valor. But the British had then sent a professional army. General Howe's forces were formidable. The Continental Army under Washington was undertrained, undersupplied, and held together largely by force of will. In August of 1776, just weeks after the Declaration, the British would inflict a serious defeat on Washington at the Battle of Long Island, and Washington would only save his army through a remarkable night retreat across the East River in small boats under cover of fog. Before that retreat, the outcome was entirely unclear, and many serious military minds thought it likely that the rebellion would be suppressed within a year or two. This is the world of July 4th, 1776, a hot room, a document being argued over, men who knew with the clarity that comes from genuine danger that what they were deciding could not be undone. And so we find them, 56 men, more or less, milling around the State House in the gathering heat of July. Some are certain, some are terrified, some have already made their peace with danger and are impatient with the others. Some are still arguing that there might be another way, a negotiated return, a constitutional settlement, something that doesn't require the complete and irreversible severing of their legal identity as British subjects, because that is also what is at stake, not just their lives, their entire conception of who they are. This is where our story lives, and somewhere in the long debated mysterious hours of this particular summer, a figure enters the room and changes everything. Chapter 2. The actual timeline. Before we can speak of the unknown, we need to establish the known, and the known is considerably more complicated than most people realize, because the popular image of the signing of the Declaration of Independence is itself a kind of historical fiction, albeit a beloved one. Let us start with the most fundamental misconception. Most Americans, if asked when the Declaration of Independence was signed, will say July 4th, 1776. July 4th, Independence Day, the date on the document, the day we celebrate. But here is the first and most important thing to understand. The famous document you know, the one with all 56 signatures, the one in the National Archive under special lighting, was not signed on July 4th. Most historians now believe the bulk of signing happened on August 2nd, 1776, nearly a month later, and even then, not all signers were present. What actually happened on July 4th? The Second Continental Congress voted to adopt the text of the Declaration of Independence. The document was approved, but the only two men who signed that original copy were John Hancock as President of the Congress and Charles Thomson as Secretary. That was it. 2 signatures on a document that was then sent to the printer John Dunlap, who ran off approximately 200 copies through the night. These are the famous Dunlap broadsides, which were then distributed to the state assemblies, military commanders, and town criers. The actual engrossing, the creation of the beautiful, formal parchment copy we revere, was not even ordered until July 19th, when Congress voted to have the document written out in large official script on proper parchment and signed by every member. The embossing was probably done by Timothy Matlock, a Philadelphia scribe known for his fine hand. That parchment was ready for signing on August 2nd, and that is when the most delegates present added their names. Several others signed later, some as late as November of 1776. One delegate, Thomas McKean of Delaware, may not have signed until as late as 1781, a full 5 years after the document's adoption. This matters enormously for the story of the unknown orator, because the legend places a mysterious stranger in the room on July 4th, delivering a speech that compels the assembled delegates to rush forward and sign. But the delegates did not sign on July 4th. There was no dramatic signing ceremony that day. There was a vote, followed by a document being sent to a printer. The story, as it is most often told, is built on a historical scaffold that does not exist. There is even some confusion about the vote itself. The actual vote for independence took place on July 2nd, 1776, when 12 of 13 colonies voted in favor. New York abstained, waiting for authorization from its state convention. John Adams famously believed July 2nd would be the date celebrated by future generations. He wrote to his wife Abigail on July 3rd, "The 2nd day of July 1776 will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America." He was wrong about the date, as it turns out, but right about the magnitude. The text was then debated and edited on July 3rd and 4th, before final adoption on July 4th. So when precisely might the unknown orator have spoken? The legends say July 4th in the late afternoon or evening. The Congress did continue its session through July 4th, though the day's business was primarily the final editing and adoption of Jefferson's text. Some accounts place the orator in the final hours of debate, when the issue of signing hung in the air and tempers were frayed. Others, working backward from the legend's logic, suggest the speech happened just before the formal adoption vote. All of this is contested. Some versions of the story seem unaware of the signing timeline entirely, and speak as though there was a single dramatic moment when all 56 delegates gathered with quill in hand and debated whether to put their names to paper. That moment, historically speaking, did not happen. Not on July 4th, and not all at once. It happened in pieces, over months, quietly and unremarkably. But the legend persists, and the legend has teeth, so let us follow it. Chapter 3. The Speech. Before we can talk about who the unknown orator was or wasn't, we need to hear what he supposedly said. Because the speech, or rather the various versions of the speech that have come down to us, is itself a remarkable document. It is dramatic, soaring, almost operatically overwrought, the kind of rhetoric that sounds nothing like the careful, lawyerly language of the actual founders. In everything, like a 19th century abolitionist pamphlet. The version most people know comes filtered through many hands, but the earliest and most vivid version was written by a man named George Lippard. George Lippard was born in Chester County, Pennsylvania in 1822. He was a strange, electric figure, a radical reformer, a labor organizer, a novelist of lurid and socially conscious Gothic fiction. He had a gift for sensation and a deep, sincere commitment to the working poor. He dropped out of seminary after deciding the church was more interested in property than in souls. He worked as a journalist. He became one of the most widely read novelists in the United States in the 1840s, not because he was a great prose stylist, he was not, but because he understood the particular hunger of his reading public for stories that were at once morally instructive and thrillingly melodramatic. His masterwork, The Quaker City, or The Monks of Monk Hall, was a sprawling Gothic expose of Philadelphia high society that sold 60,000 copies in its first year. It is probably the best-selling American novel that nobody reads today. Lepard was also deeply patriotic in the particular way of the 1840s, a patriotism not of the elite founding fathers, but of the common people who had suffered and died to make the revolution. He believed the founders were not gods, but men, and that the men most worthy of remembrance were not always the ones who got their names on documents. He wrote what he called historical fictions and legends, which he defined as history in its detail and delicate tints, with the bloom and dew yet fresh upon it, yet told to us in the language of passion, of poetry, of home. It is also worth understanding what was happening in America in 1847 when Lepard published his story. The 1840s were a decade of profound national anxiety. The question of slavery was tearing at the political fabric of the Republic. The Mexican-American War, which Lepard opposed, was raising pointed questions about whether American expansion was an expression of freedom or an exercise of imperial power. Immigration was transforming the cities. The gap between the founding ideals and the lived reality of the nation was widening, visibly and painfully. In this environment, a story that returned to the founding moment and insisted on the transcendent meaning of the Declaration, that it was not merely a political document, but a sacred promise to all people, including the slaves in bondage, including the mechanic in the workshop, was not escapism. It was a pointed commentary on the present through the medium of the past. Lepard's unknown orator speaks repeatedly and emphatically of the slave. This is not accidental. Lepard was an ardent opponent of slavery, and the speech he puts in his orator's mouth is, among other things, an abolitionist text, an insistence that the Declaration means what it says, that all men are created equal is not a rhetorical formality, but a binding moral commitment, and that those who signed their names to it made a promise to every human being, not merely to propertied white men in colonial America. On January 2nd, 1847, the Philadelphia Saturday Courier published a short piece by Lepard titled The 4th of July, 1776. It was later collected in his book, Washington and His Generals, or Legends of the Revolution, published the same year. The story introduces a tall, slender man dressed in dark robe, whose identity is left deliberately unnamed, who rises to speak when the assembled delegates seem to be faltering. Then comes the speech. The speech in Lepard's version is approximately 3,000 words. It is a magnificent piece of period rhetoric, fevered, biblical, full of imagery drawn from revolution and martyrdom, and divine providence. It begins with the word gibbet, shouted into the room, and builds from there into a sweeping vision of human freedom, the judgment of tyrannical kings, and God's specific intention that America be free. Here is a compressed sense of it. The orator begins by addressing the gibbet directly, the gallows, the thing they all fear. He says, "Let them hang us. Let them make every tree a gallows, every rock a scaffold, every home a grave. The words on that parchment will outlive everybody swinging on every rope in the land." He speaks of the slave in bondage, who will one day read these words as hope. He speaks of kings, purpled hangmen of the world, who will one day be judged by the very principles now being written into law. He invokes the recording angel standing before the throne of God, bearing a black book full of the crimes of the old world. And God, he tells them, has spoken from the cloud. Let there be a new world. Let my people go out from wrong, in oppression, in blood. And then he closes with the famous pounding refrain, sign. If the next moment the gibbet's rope is around your neck, sign. If the next moment this hall rings with the echo of the falling axe, sign. By all your hopes in life or death, as husbands, as fathers, as men, sign your names to the parchment or be accursed forever. The effect in Lepard's telling is electric. The delegates who had been paralyzed by fear rush forward as one body to add their signatures. The parchment is signed. The nation is born. And when they turn to thank the mysterious speaker who made it possible, he is gone. Lepard's orator is described as wearing dark robes despite the summer heat, which is an odd and striking detail. He has burning dark eyes. His hands move with strange hypnotic grace as he speaks. He appears to be neither young nor particularly strong of voice, yet he commands the room completely. He is described in various retellings as middle-aged or older, as pale, as gaunt, as somehow not quite belonging to the ordinary world of sweating delegates and flies in warm July air. He vanishes through locked and guarded doors. Lepard presents this as a legend. He never claims it is historically documented. He is working in the genre of the patriotic romance, a genre that was enormously popular in his era and that everyone understood to involve creative embellishment of historical events. He was, in his own words, writing fiction. The problem is that the story was so vivid, so perfectly calibrated to the emotional needs of its readers, that it escaped its fictional container and began to circulate as history. This happens more often than we like to admit. Chapter 4. The Transmission. Understanding how the unknown orator story traveled from Lepard's fiction into the mainstream of American historical consciousness requires us to trace a chain of transmission that spans nearly a century, involves several remarkable figures, and ends in the Oval Office. The first link in the chain after Lepard is a more diffuse cultural transmission. The story circulated in newspapers, in patriotic speeches, in 4th of July orations. It was told and retold the way folk stories are told, with modifications, with embellishments, with the gradual loss of the qualifying "it is said" or "legend tells us" that distinguished fiction from fact. By the turn of the 20th century, the unknown orator had appeared in enough places that readers who encountered him could be forgiven for assuming he had a documentary foundation. The world into which this legend arrived in 1928, when an esoteric writer named Manly Palmer Hall would pick it up and transform it, was deeply receptive to esoteric interpretations of American history. The theosophical tradition, founded by Helena Blavatsky in the 1870s, had seeded the idea throughout intellectual culture that the physical, political world was the surface expression of deeper spiritual realities. Madame Blavatsky's Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine proposed vast historical syntheses in which ancient wisdom traditions, Eastern and Western, converged in a single picture of reality guided by Mahatmas, advanced beings working invisibly for human evolution. Her colleague Annie Besant brought theosophy into a global audience in the early 20th century. By the 1920s, theosophical ideas had penetrated not just occult circles, but mainstream progressive culture, influencing everything from the arts and craft movement to progressive education to early feminism. In America specifically, this esoteric tradition had developed a patriotic inflection. The United States was, in this tradition, not merely a country, but a spiritual experiment, an attempt to instantiate in political form the principles of an ancient wisdom. The Great Seal of the United States, with its all-seeing eye above an unfinished pyramid, and the motto Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages, was treated as explicit Masonic and Hermetic symbolism built into the founding iconography. That this seal was designed by people influenced by Enlightenment and Masonic thought is historically accurate. What the esoteric tradition does with this fact is to extend it into something larger, evidence of a deliberate initiated plan. The most important single transmission happened in 1928, when Manly Palmer Hall, a self-educated Canadian-born mystic who would become one of the 20th century's most influential esoteric scholars, publishes The Secret Teachings of All Ages, one of the most extraordinary books ever written in America, a vast, lavishly illustrated encyclopedia of world esoteric tradition that runs over 600 pages and attempts to synthesize the entire history of human mystical knowledge into a single coherent system. Hall was 27 years old when he wrote it. He had no formal academic credentials. He had prodigious self-education, an astonishing memory, and an absolute conviction that the surface story of history, the kings and battles and documents version, was merely the outer shell of a deeper, more important narrative, driven by secret societies, esoteric initiates, and the long, patient work of hidden philosophical brotherhoods. In The Secret Teachings of All Ages, Hall introduces the unknown orator, whom he does not name, as evidence of this deeper narrative. He describes the mysterious stranger at the signing, his vanishing through locked doors, and asks rhetorically whether this figure might have been one of the agents of the secret order, guarding and directing the destiny of America. He is not certain. He frames it as a question, a suggestion, an invitation to wonder. But the framing is significant. In Hall's telling, the orator is not merely a patriotic citizen who wandered in with a good speech. He is something else. He is an emissary. Then, in 1944, Hall publishes The Secret Destiny of America, a shorter, more focused work, written in part as a wartime morale booster. The book argues in Hall's characteristic mix of the scholarly and the mystical that America was always intended to be the site of a great experiment in human freedom, that this intention was not accidental or merely political, that it had been planned centuries in advance by a hidden brotherhood of philosophers who had guided events from behind the scenes. The unknown orator appears again in this context, now more prominently. Hall identifies him as possibly a Rosicrucian adept, possibly the same mysterious figure he calls the professor, who had appeared earlier in colonial circles, a man of disciplined, ascetic habits who ate no meat, no root, no unripe fruit, who drank no liquor, who spent his time studying ancient manuscripts. Hall's description of the professor is strikingly specific in its physical and behavioral details, which gives it the texture of biography even as its subject remains unnamed. We are told this figure worked with both Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. We are told he helped design the flag. We are told he appeared and disappeared from American history without explanation, leaving behind no verifiable record. Hall's implicit and sometimes explicit suggestion is that the figure was the Count of Saint Germain. This is where our story enters fully into esoteric territory. The Saint Germain theory is not fringe in the sense of being obscure. It is, in certain traditions of esoteric and New Age thought, an article of faith with a large and sincere following. Chapter 5. The Candidates. Who was he? Let us now consider the various candidates who have been proposed for the identity of the unknown orator. Each theory comes with its own evidentiary tradition, its own logic, its own emotional and spiritual weight. The theory of Patrick Henry. The most mundane proposal, and the one that a sober 1911 anthology of American political speeches actually committed to print, is that the unknown orator was simply Patrick Henry, the great Virginia orator, whose "Give me liberty or give me death" speech had already made him the most famous voice of the Revolution. There is a certain logic to this. If you needed someone to give a barn-burning, neck-on-the-line, what are you waiting for speech, Patrick Henry was your man. He had the voice, the conviction, the rhetorical firepower. The problem is that Patrick Henry was definitively not in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776. He had resigned from the Continental Congress in May of 1776 to return to Virginia, where he was about to become the first governor of the Commonwealth. The 1911 anthology that names him seems simply to have been wrong, perhaps confusing the Third Virginia Convention, where Henry did speak, with the Continental Congress. Moreover, the speech attributed to the unknown orator actually references Patrick Henry by name in some versions, citing the voice of Patrick Henry as an inspiration, which would make Henry a rather extraordinary third-person self-referencer, declaiming his own legacy in the middle of a speech he was supposedly giving. The theory of Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine is another recurring candidate, and he fits the profile better in some ways. Paine was the author of Common Sense, the 1776 pamphlet that had done more to shift popular opinion toward independence than perhaps any other single document. He was a passionate, eloquent advocate for the rights of common people, exactly the constituency Lepard's speech addresses when it speaks of the mechanic in his workshop and the slave in his mines. Paine also had the habit of appearing unexpectedly in important moments. He was born in Thetford, Norfolk, in 1737, the son of a Quaker corset maker. He had no great education, no aristocratic connections, no obvious claim to the world stage. He failed at corset making. He failed as a sailor. He failed as an excise officer, was dismissed, rehired, and dismissed again after writing a petition on behalf of his fellow officers, arguing they deserved better pay, an early sign of his instinct to advocate loudly for working people at personal cost. He was, by the age of 37, a twice married, twice separated, financially ruined nobody in England. Then he met Benjamin Franklin, who gave him a letter of introduction and suggested he try America. Paine arrived in Philadelphia in November 1774, nearly broke, and within a year was editing the Pennsylvania Magazine. Within 2 years, he had written Common Sense, published in January 1776, which sold an estimated 100,000 copies in its first 3 months in a country of roughly 2.5 million people. By the standards of the era, it was the most widely distributed political pamphlet in American history. It argued in plain, direct, firelit language that anyone could understand that independence from Britain was not merely desirable, but inevitable, that monarchy was a ridiculous and unnatural institution, and that America had an opportunity to begin the world over again. It is not an exaggeration to say that Common Sense changed the political weather of the colonies. Then that same year, when Washington's army was in desperate straits after a series of defeats in New York, demoralized, deserting, marching without shoes in December cold, Paine appeared again. He joined the retreat across New Jersey and wrote The American Crisis by Firelight, its opening line one of the most famous in American letters. These are the times that try men's souls. Washington ordered it read out loud to his troops before crossing the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776. It is credited with helping hold the army together at the moment it was closest to dissolution. So when people suggest Paine as the unknown orator, the logic is clear. Here is a man who wrote the words that made independence thinkable, who then showed up among freezing soldiers and wrote the words that made continued resistance possible. He had a pattern of appearing at the exact moment his voice was most needed. A mysterious speech in Philadelphia in July 1776 fits the pattern. But Paine was also well known in Philadelphia. He would have been recognized instantly. The mystery of the unknown orator depends specifically on no one knowing who he was. And in Philadelphia, Thomas Paine was one of the most famous men in the colonies. His anonymity is impossible. Furthermore, Paine's rhetorical style, while powerful, was notably different from the speech Lepard records. Paine was a rationalist who distrusted organized religion and wrote in plain prose aimed at ordinary readers, whereas the unknown orator's speech, as Lepard renders it, is drenched in biblical imagery, angels, divine judgment, and Jehovah speaking from clouds. These are not Paine's registers. The theological grandeur of the unknown orator's speech sounds much more like a revivalist preacher than that of the author of The Age of Reason, which Paine would publish in 1794 as an explicit attack on institutional Christianity. The theory of the Rosicrucian adept. Here is where the story opens out into something larger and stranger. The Rosicrucians were a semi-mythical European secret society that first appeared in a set of anonymous German manifestos published between 1614 and 1616, texts calling for a reformation of human knowledge, a synthesis of Christianity and Hermetic philosophy, a brotherhood of invisibly operating adepts working for the regeneration of the world. Whether the original Rosicrucians were real or literary hoax has been debated for 400 years. By the 18th century, various real fraternal organizations had adopted the name and symbolism. The Rosicrucians' interpretation of the unknown orator follows a specific logic. If a secret brotherhood had been guiding the development of human freedoms for centuries, then the founding of America, the most ambitious political experiment in human liberty to date, would not have been left to chance. They would have had people there. They would have had agents in place, invisible helpers who appeared at crucial moments to ensure that the plan did not fail. This is the framework in which Hall's professor makes sense. A Rosicrucian initiate, operating under a pseudonym, moving through colonial circles without leaving records, would by definition be untraceable. His invisibility is not a gap in the historical record. It is the point. The Brotherhood trained its member to be invisible precisely so they could operate without interference. The specific dietary habits and scholarly practices attributed to the professor, eating only foods that grew above the ground, studying old manuscripts, living in careful austerity, are associated in esoteric tradition with practices of certain Hermetic and Rosicrucian orders. The details feel too specific to be invented, though the opposite argument, that they are too perfectly calibrated to suggest a Rosicrucian, can equally be made. The theory of Francis Bacon. A significant strand of esoteric American history holds that Sir Francis Bacon, the English philosopher, statesman, and alleged founder of speculative Freemasonry, who died in 1626, was the secret architect of the entire American project. This theory, developed most extensively by Hall and his predecessors, suggests that Bacon's New Atlantis, 1627, a utopian novel set on a wise and free island nation, was not merely fiction but a blueprint, a description written in advance of what America was intended to become. Bacon, on this reading, organized the colonization of the Americas as a grand philosophical experiment in free government, and his spiritual descendants maintained the project over the following century and a half. This theory requires Bacon to have either lived far longer than the historical record suggests. He is believed to have died at 65, or to have set in motion an organizational structure so durable and committed that it operated effectively for 150 years after his death. Neither is impossible in principle, though the evidence of the circumstantial and symbolic variety rather than the documentary. What connects Bacon to the unknown orator is the idea that the 1776 apparition was not Bacon himself, but a representative of his continuing work, possibly the same Rosicrucian adept Hall calls the professor, possibly someone else in a long chain of initiated figures. The theory of the Count of Saint Germain. The Count of Saint Germain is the most dramatic candidate, and the one who has attracted the most sustained and devoted attention from esoteric researchers. He is also, by any sober reckoning, the most extraordinary figure of the 18th century, whether we accept the mystical interpretation of his nature or not. The historical Count of Saint Germain appears in European court records beginning in the 1740s. He was a man of evidently aristocratic bearing, tremendous cultivation, apparent wealth, and mysterious origin. He spoke several languages fluently. Accounts range from 8 to 12, played violin beautifully, composed music, painted, claimed to possess alchemical secrets, and seemed to enjoy a strange immunity to the ravages of time. He first appears in European records in his apparent 40s or 50s, and several decades later is still described as looking the same age. He claimed, in the company he kept, to have been present at famous historical events that had occurred centuries before his apparent birth. He dined in fine houses across Europe, but was never seen to eat. He was observed at courts in France, England, the Netherlands, and Austria. He corresponded with Freemasons and Rosicrucians across the continent. Horace Walpole encountered him in London in 1743 and described him as a man who sings, plays the violin wonderfully, composes, is mad, and is not very sensible. Madame de Pompadour, the influential mistress of Louis XV, spoke of him with fascination. Louis XV himself is said to have held private conversations with him and to have valued his counsel on matters of statecraft. Voltaire, not a man given to credulity about the supernatural, described Saint Germain as a man who never dies and who knows everything. Frederick the Great of Prussia called him the man who cannot die. The mystery of his origin has never been resolved. The most plausible historical theories suggest he was the natural or legitimate son of Francis II Rákóczi, Prince of Transylvania, which would explain his comfortable finances, his aristocratic manner, and his carefully maintained anonymity. Another theory holds he was the son of a Sephardic Jewish merchant family from Amsterdam. Yet another proposes he was born in the village of San Germano in Piedmont, which would explain his chosen name. None of these theories is conclusively supported by documentary evidence. What we know is this: the historical record shows the Count of Saint Germain active in Europe through the 1770s and into the 1780s. He died, or is recorded as having died, in 1784 in the household of Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel in Eckerfjord, in what is now northern Germany. The prince himself, a Freemason and esoteric enthusiast, was said to have collaborated with Saint Germain on alchemical and Masonic projects in his final years. The historical documents show that the Count of Saint Germain was in Leipzig in October 1776, operating under the alias Count Weldon or Count Woldon, where he was in contact with Freemasons and members of various esoteric orders. This is a matter of documentary record. Letters survived. He is in Europe in 1776. He is, by official genealogical reckoning, dead by 1784. Yet the esoteric tradition holds that the Count of Saint Germain was an ascended master, an immortal being who had achieved a level of spiritual development beyond ordinary human mortality, able to appear and disappear at will, to move between continents without conventional travel, to operate outside the normal constraints of physical existence. In this framework, his appearance in Philadelphia on July 4, 1776, is entirely consistent with his simultaneous documented presence in Europe. He simply was in both places, as an ascended master could be. The theosophical tradition, developed by Helena Blavatsky from the 1870s onward, and elaborated by her successors, places Saint Germain in the hierarchy of Mahatmas, advanced beings of extraordinary spiritual development, who work invisibly for human evolution. He is associated in theosophical lore with the violet flame, a spiritual energy of transformation and purification. Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater both wrote about him as being of high initiation. This is, of course, not a theory that conventional historical methodology can engage with on evidentiary terms, but it is a tradition with millions of sincere adherents within theosophy, within various New Age traditions, within certain strands of Christian mysticism that have incorporated the Saint Germain mythology. The I Am activity, a religious movement founded in the 1930s by Guy and Edna Ballard, regards Saint Germain as a divine being specifically associated with the freedom of America. Indeed, as the ruling intelligence behind the American ideal of liberty. The Church Universal and Triumphant, founded by Mark and Elizabeth Clare Prophet in the 1950s and still active, reveres him as an ascended master whose great work is the ongoing liberation of humanity. For these traditions, the unknown orator is not a mystery at all. He is a confirmed identity, and the confirmation is not archival, but spiritual. Chapter 6. Manly P. Hall. Now we'll spend more time with Manly Palmer Hall, because no figure is more responsible for the shape this legend took in the 20th century. Hall was born in 1901 in Ontario, Canada, and grew up in the United States. He had no formal higher education, but from his youth he was possessed by a voracious hunger for knowledge about the hidden traditions of human spirituality, the Kabbalah, Hermeticism, alchemy, Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, Theosophy, and the mystery traditions of Egypt, Greece, and India. He was a prodigious reader, a compelling speaker, and a man of genuine personal charisma who built a devoted following through public lectures beginning in his early 20s. His 1928 Secret Teachings of All Ages remains his masterpiece in his monument. It is a book that defies easy categorization, part encyclopedia, part philosophical argument, part visual feast. The original edition contained lavish color plates of esoteric symbols and illustrations. It argues, in essence, that beneath the surface narrative of Western history runs a deeper story, the story of the initiated few who have preserved, transmitted, and gradually enacted an ancient wisdom tradition aimed at the liberation and elevation of humanity. Hall's relationship to Freemasonry is worth noting. He was made a 33rd degree Mason in 1973, the highest degree that Freemasonry can bestow, a distinction given to him in recognition of his decades of work preserving and interpreting Masonic tradition. But he was not a conventional Mason. He came to the institution from the outside, as a scholar and synthesizer, and the institution came to him as a recognition of his achievements. In The Secret Destiny of America, 1944, Hall makes explicit what secret teaching had implied, that the founding of the United States was not accidental, not merely political, but the culmination of a plan laid down over millennia by a brotherhood of philosophical initiates. He traced this plan from ancient Egypt through Plato's Republic, through the mystery schools of Greece, through the medieval alchemists and the original Rosicrucians, from Francis Bacon through the Freemasons, among the founders to 1776. The unknown orator in Hall's telling is a pivot point, the moment when the abstract plan becomes concrete, when the philosophical intention is actualized in political reality. Hall asks, was this figure one of the agents of the secret order? He does not insist, he wonders, but the wondering is structured so that the reader is led inescapably toward yes. Hall's book became an underground classic of American occultism, passed from hand to hand, studied in Masonic lodges and theosophical study circles, and eventually in the broader New Age milieu that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. And then, improbably, they reached the most powerful office in the world. Ronald Wilson Reagan, 40th President of the United States, appears to have read Hall's work and been genuinely moved by it. Reagan had a long-standing interest in matters metaphysical. His famous consultation with the astrologer John Quigley are well documented, but the depth of his engagement with esoteric history is less widely known. At a commencement address at his alma mater, Eureka College, in 1957, before he was even a political figure, Reagan told the story of the unknown orator to the graduating class, citing it as an inspiring example of the divine providence at work in American history. He did not name Hall as his source. He presented it as received history. Then, in July 1981, Parade magazine asked the new president for a personal essay about what the 4th of July meant to him. Reagan's aide, Michael Deaver, delivered the piece to the editors with a note stating that this 4th of July message is the president's own words and written initially in the president's hand on a yellow pad at Camp David. Reagan's essay tells the story of the unknown orator, almost verbatim from Hall, though in slightly simplified and more accessible language. He describes the debate raging in the hall, the hesitation of the delegates, the walls resounding with cries of treason and the headsman's axe, and then he writes, "Then it is said, one unknown man rose to speak. He was neither young nor strong in voice, yet he spoke with such conviction that he mesmerized the hall. He cited the grievances that had brought them to this moment. Then, his voice failing, he said, 'They may turn every tree into a gallows, every hole into a grave, and yet the words of that parchment can never die. To the mechanic in the workshop, they will speak hope. To the slave in the mines, freedom. Sign that parchment. Sign of the next moment the noose is around your neck, for that parchment will be the textbook of freedom, the Bible of the rights of man forever.' And sign they did. And then, when they turned to thank the speaker for his timely words, he couldn't be found, and to this day, no one knows who he was or how he entered or left the guarded room. The sitting president of the United States, writing in the nation's most widely circulated Sunday magazine, presented the story as historical fact, or near enough. The "it is said" does minimal work when spoken by the most powerful person in the country in an official Independence Day message. To millions of readers, this was simply something that had happened. And yet, Reagan's own staff could not source it. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello, which has cataloged and indexed Jefferson's writings with extraordinary thoroughness, states flatly that no version of the unknown orator story appears anywhere in Jefferson's papers. The story does not come from Jefferson. It comes from Lepard, by way of Hall, by way of Reagan. This is the story's journey in brief. A Victorian sensation novelist writes a patriotic legend. A 20th century occult philosopher transformed it into evidence for a secret destiny. A president of the United States tells it to the nation as history. Chapter 7. The Historian's Verdict. The case against the historical reality of the unknown orator rests on several distinct lines of argument, each of which is substantial on its own and collectively rather overwhelming. The signing problem. As we established in Chapter 2, the famous signing did not happen on July 4th, 1776. The majority of delegates signed the engrossed parchment on August 2nd. On July 4th, only Hancock and Thompson signed. There was no moment when a gathered group of 56 delegates debated whether to sign and needed a mysterious stranger to push them over the edge. The dramatic scene the legend requires did not occur. This is not a small objection. The locked room problem. The State House in Philadelphia was not, in any documented record, locked and guarded in the fashion the legend implies on July 4th, 1776. It was a functioning legislative space where delegates, visitors, clerks, and others moved in and out. The detail of locked doors through which the stranger mysteriously entered and exited is a Gothic flourish that appears in later tellings, primarily in Hall's version, and has no grounding in any contemporary account of the day. In Lepard's original text, the detail is less extreme. The stranger simply disappears when people look for him, which could be explained by ordinary confusion in a crowded room. The locked and guarded formulation, which lends the episode its supernatural texture, is in addition. The contemporary sources problem. No contemporary account of the Continental Congress's July 4th session, and we have many, including letters, diaries, and official journals, mentions any unknown stranger delivering a stirring speech. The men in that room were compulsive letter writers. John Adams wrote to Abigail constantly, in exhaustive detail. Jefferson kept notes. Benjamin Franklin had correspondence across 2 continents. If a mysterious black-robed stranger had appeared and delivered a 3,000-word oration so powerful it moved the delegates to tears and immediate action, someone would have written about it. No one did. The Lepard problem. George Lepard, the origin point of the legend, never claimed to be writing history. He explicitly characterized his work as historical fiction and legend. The story appeared in a book called Legends of the Revolution, not History of the Revolution. The framing was always clear. This is what Lepard believed ought to have happened, not a report of what did. The migration of the story from inspired fiction to disputed history to presidential fact happened not because new evidence emerged, but because each transmission stripped away a layer of qualifying language until only the story itself remained, vivid, emotionally satisfying, and sourceless. The Jefferson problem. Both Hall and Reagan invoked Thomas Jefferson's writing as the source of the story. Neither could produce the citation. Monticello has searched and found nothing. The Jefferson attribution appears to be either a confusion or an embellishment designed to lend the story the authority of a founding father's eyewitness account. Either way, it is false. Chapter 8. Why the Story Will Not Die. And yet, all of this debunking, accurate as it is, fails to explain why the story refuses to die, why George Lepard's fiction became Hall's evidence, became Reagan's history, became a staple of July 4th speeches and Independence Day email in patriotic websites and podcast episodes. There is something in the legend that is not answered by pointing out its historical impossibility. At the most obvious level, it performs a function that all founding myths perform. It personifies the abstract. The Declaration of Independence as a document can be analyzed and debated and parsed. The unknown orator cannot. He is a presence, a voice, a physical person who once stood in a room and said, "This is the moment and you must not flinch." He gives the founding a human face, or rather a deliberately faceless human face, which paradoxically makes it easier to project onto him whatever the moment requires. We might compare this to the similar function played by the image of the soldier who fights without knowing whether the cause will succeed, or the immigrant who crosses an ocean on faith, or the parent who sacrifices without expectation of acknowledgement. These figures are valuable not because they are specific, but because they are universal. The unknown orator works the same way. He could be anyone. In some important sense, he is everyone who has ever been in a room where a crucial decision was being delayed by fear. At a deeper level, the story addresses a genuine psychological complexity in the founding narrative. The Declaration of Independence is a radical document, perhaps the most radical political document ever written by men of property. It asserts universal human equality. It asserts the right of any people to overthrow any government that fails them. It does not hedge these claims for particular contexts or particular people. Then there is the esoteric interpretation, which takes this deeper still. If the unknown orator was an agent of a secret brotherhood, then American democracy is not merely a political experiment. It is a spiritual one. It is the latest and most ambitious phase of a project begun in ancient times, aimed at nothing less than the liberation of the entire human race. The founding of America is not an accident of history. It is a destiny. This idea has enormous power. It has animated presidents from the obvious Masonic symbolism on the dollar bill to Reagan's vision of America as a city upon a hill, as not merely a metaphor, but a literal spiritual designation. John Winthrop coined the phrase in 1630, speaking to the passengers of the Arbella about the kind of godly community they were meant to build. John F. Kennedy echoed it. Reagan made it central to his political identity. The idea that America was meant not as nationalism, not as exceptionalism in the crude sense, but as genuine cosmic intention, is an idea that has driven an enormous amount of American self-understanding. The unknown orator is the figure in whom this idea is most purely expressed. He appears from nowhere. He says precisely what needs to be said. He disappears. He leaves no biography, no claim to credit, no political agenda, no subsequent history. He is pure purpose, pure presence, pure voice. He is what every mythology needs, a figure who is exactly as large as the moment requires. Chapter 9. The Liberty Bell and the Expanding Legend. In Ring Grandfather Ring, the popular name given to Lepard's story derived from its subplot, the legend includes a scene in which an old bell ringer in the State House steeple is told by a small boy that the Declaration has been signed, and rings the great bell in celebration. The crowd below, hearing the peal, erupts in joy. This scene is the origin of the legend that the Liberty Bell rang to celebrate the Declaration of Independence. Historians have largely concluded that this too did not happen, at least not in the precise form Lepard describes. We do not know if the State House bell rang on July 4th, 1776. The documentary record is silent on this point. The name Liberty Bell itself was coined by abolitionists in the 1830s, who chose it for the inscription on the bell, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof," and used the bell as a symbol in their campaign against slavery, decades before Lepard wrote his story. The crack in the bell, which is perhaps its most iconic feature today, appears to have developed gradually and became serious sometimes in the early 19th century. The myth that the crack occurred while ringing to celebrate the signing of the Declaration is another accretion, a detail that makes the bell's imperfection into a narrative consequence rather than the mere metal fatigue. What Lepard's story did in both the Unknown Orator episode and the Liberty Bell episode was to give vivid embodied form to the founding moment. Before Lepard, the Declaration was a text and a vote. After Lepard, it was also a bell ringing across a summer city, a stranger vanishing through locked doors, and 56 men rushing forward to write their names in history because someone had finally told them, in language that cut through the fear to the bone of what they believed, sign. This is what literature can do that history cannot. It does not record what happened. It records what ought to have happened. The fact that scholars can demonstrate these things did not happen in the way the story described is almost besides the point. These stories are not primarily informational. They are constitutional, in the original Latin sense, constituting, constructing, making something. The myth of the unknown orator constitutes a certain kind of American identity. It says, at the beginning we were afraid, and something beyond ourselves, call it providence, call it the brotherhood, call it the better angels of our nature, spoke to us and made us brave. We were not self-made. We were helped into being by a voice we could not identify, and that voice has never entirely left. Chapter 10. The Afterlife. The Unknown Orator story lives comfortably in the 21st century, moving through social media, YouTube essays, podcast episodes, Independence Day email chains, and the voluminous literature of American esoteric tradition that has found new vitality in the internet age. It appears in New Age spirituality as confirmation of Saint Germain's ongoing role as guardians of American freedom. In these communities, the story is not historical curiosity, but living theology, the account of a divine being's active intervention in the material world on behalf of human liberty. It is cited in prayers, in channeled messages purportedly from Saint Germain himself, in the literature of the I Am activity, in the Church Universal and Triumphant, and in the broader New Age synthesis that treats the founding of America as a sacred event. It appears in Masonic histories as evidence of the Brotherhood's practical involvement in the founding. The story fits neatly within a Masonic narrative about the fraternity's role as a carrier of Enlightenment values across the Atlantic. The idea that the Masonic lodges of colonial America were not merely social clubs, but intellectual and philosophical cells where the ideas of human liberty were incubated and eventually enacted. In this context, an unknown Masonic adept appearing at the crucial moment is not supernatural. It is simply the Brotherhood at work. It appears in a 2014 Salon article about Ronald Reagan's relationship with Manly Hall's occultism, which is one of the more unexpectedly fascinating pieces of presidential history writing in recent memory. Mitch Horowitz, the PEN Award-winning historian of American esoteric culture and a genuine scholar of these traditions, has written about the story with a kind of nuanced engagement it deserves, neither credulous nor dismissive, but genuinely curious about what the story's life tells us about American mythology and politics. Horowitz makes the point that Reagan's use of the unknown orator story was not an aberration in an otherwise rationalist presidency, but part of a consistent pattern. Reagan inhabited, intellectually and emotionally, a version of America that was deeply shaped by the esoteric tradition's reading of the founding, the shining city on a hill, the special destiny of the American people, the sense that history was moving toward freedom as toward a destination rather than drifting randomly. These were not rhetorical flourishes for Reagan. They were convictions, and those convictions had sources, and some of those sources were Manly P. Hall. This is, if you think about it, a remarkable fact about American political history, that a tradition running from Renaissance Hermeticism to Rosicrucian Manifesto to Masonic lodges to Theosophical societies to a Canadian-born autodidact's bookshelf in Los Angeles should have shaped the 4th of July rhetoric of a two-term president of the United States. The esoteric tradition is not a marginal curiosity of American culture. It is woven into the fabric. Chapter 11. Sitting with the Mystery. On July 4th, 1776, in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress voted to adopt the text of the Declaration of Independence. The men in that room knew they were doing something dangerous and historic. Only Hancock and Thompson signed the original that day. The majority of the signatures came on August 2nd. No contemporary account records the presence of a mysterious stranger, and no search of the documentary record has found any trace of one. The story of the unknown orator was invented or discovered, depending on your epistemology, by George Lepard in 1847. He presented it as a legend, not history. Manly P. Hall elevated it into evidence for an esoteric theory of American history. Ronald Reagan told it as fact to the nation in 1981. The story is one of the great American myths. It speaks to something true about the founding moment, the fear, the courage, the presence of the unknown in history, even though it is not literally true. It has shaped how millions of people understand July 4th. It has been used by a president to articulate a vision of America's purpose. It encodes, in its various versions, a set of questions about history, about secrecy, about divine intention and human agency that cannot be finally answered and ought not to be. And there is the long, slow arc of the story's cultural life, which is itself worth meditating on. From a Philadelphia Saturday Courier in January 1847 to a 27-year-old Canadian Mystics Encyclopedia in 1928, to a Camp David yellow legal pad in 1981, to a podcast episode listened to in the small hours of the morning in 2026. The unknown orator has traveled a remarkable distance. He has been many things to many people. He has been a patriotic legend, a Masonic allegory, a theosophical certainty, a presidential myth, a debunker's cautionary tale, and a sleepy meditation on the strangeness of how history is made and remembered. He may in the end be most valuable in that last capacity, not as proof of anything, but as an invitation to think about what we need history to mean, and why, and what those needs tell us about ourselves. Was there a stranger? Almost certainly not in the way the legend describes. Was there something mysterious about the founding moment? Something that resists complete rationalization? Almost certainly yes. The unknown orator remains unknown. Perhaps this is appropriate. Perhaps the whole point of the story is not identification but encounter, not knowing who he was, but feeling what he said. Sign. The words of that parchment can never die. To the slave in bondage, they will speak hope. Sign. The document that inspired the speech, real or invented, is real enough. It sits in the National Archives in Washington, under special atmospheric conditions and careful lighting, on the aged and faded parchment that Timothy Matlock prepared in the summer of 1776. It has been there for 2.5 centuries. The words are still legible. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If there was a stranger, that is what he was pointing to. If there was no stranger, The document points to itself. Either way, in the room that summer, 56 men eventually picked up their pens